Hi, everybody. We're gonna talk about Stephen King. So one of the things I asked you to read for this week is his essay, his very famous essay called "Why We Crave Horror Films." Um, this comes from his book on he did a book, I guess it would have been back in the 80s, called Danse Macabre, and it's basically a collection of essays about horror, about the genre, about film, about literature um, in that genre. And he just kind of, I think, because at the time in America it was coming under a lot of there was a lot of pressure on people that were writing things like that. Horror had kind of seen a resurgence in the 80s, and so there was a lot of criticism of it. And so he was just wanting to write some essays to talk about the value of some of these kinds of stories and why they're important for people and why we shouldn't shy away from them as much. So that's kind of what this essay is about. I just want to walk through it quickly with you guys and see if we can make a little bit of sense out of it. So he starts out the essay talking about, he basically just says that he thinks everybody is to some degree, everybody's mentally ill, right? That some of us do a better job of hiding it than others, but that we all have kind of a um, dark element to our psyche. There's definitely some Sigmund Freud all over this essay. So if you're familiar with any psychoanalysis or if you've been exposed to that, Freud's theories definitely have influenced King. Um, so he basically sets out to explain why in his mind, that we actually need these kinds of stories, that people need them, that they're valuable. Um, and I think the first thing that he outlines here is pretty obvious. I think if you've seen uh, a horror film and seen the way the audience reacts, a lot of people go to these kinds of movies or to read these kinds of stories because they want to, as he calls it, dare the nightmare. It's the same impulse that makes people want to ride roller coasters, right? They want to get a little bit of exhilaration. They want to be a little scared. And so he's arguing that that's one of the reasons. Another reason he argues is that these kinds of stories help us establish our sense of normality, right? So that we can kind of look at the monster on the screen and go, well, gosh, I'm not that bad, right? So I'm not that bad off. So I must not be that bad of a guy or gal. And then he says we go to have fun, right? And then he talks about how the fun is a little bit of a different kind of fun. And I remember when I was in college, I think it was the first time I ever witnessed this. So this can be a bizarre experience, but I'd gone to, I can't remember which, I think it was one of the Freddy Krueger movies. I don't remember now, but I remember at some point noticing that the audience was actually cheering for Freddy, which I thought was a little strange at the time. But the way he explains that is it's this impulse that we have. We have a very natural human impulse to want to see those kinds of things, and he's trying to get to the bottom of why that is. And you'll notice that people do that. And he mentions the public lynchings, and he's talking about, where they used to hang people in public places. Like this was very common in the Old West, right? If a criminal stole a horse, they would hang him in front of everybody, and people would like make a day of it. They would come to these hangings and have a picnic and watch people be hung. I mean, it's kind of morbid and gross. But if you think you're above that, if you think you're morally above that, then ask yourself why you slow down and rubberneck on 75 when there's a traffic accident. So a lot of people are guilty of this kind of impulse. It's a natural human impulse. There's an ancient Chinese proverb that says happiness is watching your friend fall off his roof, right? And part of that is like, hey, I'm seeing this happen to this other person, so it's not happening to me. So it makes it okay for me. It makes me feel safer, right? And he talks about how this is a deep seated thing. I'm not going to go through every single part of this, but we exhibit these emotions from very early on. right? We see little kids engaging in the what he calls anti-civilization emotions, right? Where, Johnny and Susie are playing and Johnny decides to, you know, say or do something mean to his little sister who took his toy, right? And we don't encourage that kind of behavior. And he talks about that aspect of it too, that we try to encourage the civilized emotions. And this is where it gets a little bit Freudian. Freud talked about that we have these emotions that are buried within us, right? We have our ego and our id, as he called them, are in a constant battle, right? And so our parents train us as children, teachers train us to control those emotions and not let them get too far out of control by saying, hey, you're not supposed to do that to people, or hey, treat your little sister nicely, right? Kiss your little sister, don't hit her, that kind of stuff. So we learn that, but there is some people have a desire still, right, to want to do bad things, or they may have a desire to just want to do things, right? Do things that are a little bit risky, or that they find pleasurable. So society often tells us no, that we can't do that, right? Society tells us that, hey, you have to obey the rules, and people don't like that. Freud argues that people end up burying those emotions, right? And they suppress those emotions. And he argues that those emotions have to have an outlet, right? So that if you bury that stuff for too long, it can he argues that's what causes neuroses of many different types, is that people recognize, hey, these desires I have may not be right, so I'm going to suppress them, because if I don't, there's going to be consequences from society, right? Like, you know, if you don't obey the traffic laws. You may want to drive 100 miles an hour everywhere you go and drive through red lights and stop signs, but if you do that, right, there's going to be consequences, right? You're going to injure yourself, you're going to injure other people, you might end up going to jail, those kinds of things. So people censor themselves, they control their behavior, but that desire, and this is essentially what King is arguing, he's using Freud's argument, that desire doesn't go away. It has to go somewhere. So it has to have an outlet. Now, there are healthy outlets for that, like religion is a healthy outlet for that, or can be. Exercise can be a healthy outlet. Freud argues that creative outlets can be healthy ways of dealing with those desires. But there's also dark ones too, right? So there's dark, but this is the same. Horror films have been criticized, for giving people these outlets, right? And that's essentially what King is saying, that the horror film gives you an outlet for those anti-civilization emotions that everybody feels, but they don't have a way to express. And he's like, hey, man, you go pay your money, you watch Jason chase these teenagers and do these things, and then it kind of gives you a little bit of emotional release, and you can go back to your everyday life. Now, everybody might not need that. But some people, I think, need it more so than others, right? And that's where he talks about at the end that the horror film, the horror story, kind of it gives the gators something to eat, right? That everybody has in their head, and to varying degrees. I mean, people have been arguing about this for a long time. Video games have also fallen under this criticism. You have games like Grand Theft Auto, where you have people playing a character who's committing crimes the whole game, and they get heavily criticized, like, hey, is this encouraging people to do that? And what they found is, well, for most people it doesn't. I mean, there's hundreds of millions of people around the globe that play that game. As a matter of fact, for most people it has the opposite effect. It has sort of that cathartic emotional release for them, right? It's like, hey, I can go and break these laws in this little video game and nothing bad happens to me, and it kind of gives me this psychological relief. So horror kind of serves that purpose. For people who don't really understand, like, why are you drawn to scary stories, it can help alleviate some of the psychological tension or psychological trauma that people have been through. There's even people that argue that, hey, if you've seen really terrible things or been through really terrible experiences, horror can help alleviate that for you. There's psychologists who've argued that. So it's kind of a cool essay. I think it's a good justification for these kinds of stories. And I wanted to start with that because horror is where the macabre is the one extreme that we're going to talk about in this class. And we will look at some stories that are a little bit more overtly horrific in terms of, and I don't mean that in the sense of Jason and Freddy necessarily, but things that are a little bit more scary and more overtly scary. And then the other subject that we'll touch on in this class is weird fiction, both of which fall under this big umbrella category of speculative fiction. Weird fiction's a little bit more in the gray area. I would say it's a little bit more. If you watch that video, I think it does a pretty good job of explaining it. Weird fiction kind of exists more in the liminal space, so it's not. You may have things that happen to characters that really scare them, which we will see in Lovecraft's story for next week, but it's not always overtly like in your face scary. Like there's it can touch on those kinds of things, but it's often a little bit more, well, weird, right? So characters go through a transformation, or they may have an epiphany about some part of themselves, or something may enter their world that kind of shatters their understanding of what they thought reality was. That's very common in weird stories and weird fiction. So we'll pick up with that in our next section next week with, I believe that's what we have on our schedule for next week. Is that's the wrong schedule. I believe it's Mr. Lovecraft. So I'm going to stop sharing here. Let me make sure for you guys. So for next week, you guys will be reading, yeah, The Call of Cthulhu. So that's also there. It's available in the audio. So if you want to listen to it, I recommend that you do that. It's a cool story. It's a little long. For just reading purposes, unless you're a reader. But I don't expect that everybody will be, so that's why I try to put those audio versions up there. So next week we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what Lovecraft's up to. He's a very unusual character from this genre of fiction. He also influenced Stephen King, so that's a good thing to know. He's pretty much influenced everybody that came after him. He's a very strange man, but I think that partly is why that he was able to write some of the fiction that he came up with. So we'll talk about that next week. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will see you then.